Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Today, we dive into one of California's most disturbing serial murder cases that remained unsolved for decades. Joseph Naso appeared to be an ordinary photographer, but behind his mundane exterior lurked a predator with a bizarre signature. He targeted women whose first and last names began with the same letter. From the 1970s through the 1990s, his double-initial murders claimed at least 6 victims across California, leaving a trail of evidence so meticulous it would eventually become his undoing. A routine probation check in 2010 uncovered thousands of disturbing photographs, detailed journals, and a handwritten list that would finally bring this killer to justice after more than 30 years. Let's explore how Joseph Naso's twisted obsession led to one of the most distinctive serial murder cases in American criminal history. In the quiet neighborhoods of California's Bay Area and beyond, a sinister predator lurked for decades. His name was Joseph Naso, and his horrific crimes would eventually reveal a twisted obsession with women whose first and last names began with the same letter, a signature so distinct that his case would become known as the double-initial murders. The story of Joseph Naso begins in the ordinary fashion of many serial killers. Born on January 7, 1934, in Rochester, New York, nothing about his early life seemed to predict the darkness that would later consume him. After serving in the Air Force, Naso settled into a seemingly normal existence, working as a photographer. But beneath this mundane exterior lurked violent, sadistic urges that would claim the lives of at least 6 women over a span of more than 20 years. Naso's first documented victim was Roxene Roggasch, an 18-year-old woman whose body was discovered on January 11, 1977, near Fairfax in Marin County, California. Roggasch had been reported missing just days earlier. Her body was found dumped on the side of White's Hill, a lonely stretch of road. She had been strangled with pantyhose, a distinctive method of killing that would become part of Naso's signature. The investigation revealed that she had been bound at the ankles with pantyhose that were determined not to belong to her. In fact, DNA evidence would later reveal that the pantyhose contained the DNA of Naso's wife. For years, Roggasch's murder remained unsolved, just one more tragic cold case in California's files. But Naso hadn't stopped killing. His pattern was only beginning to form. Carmen Colon, 22 years old, became Naso's next known victim. Her body was discovered near Port Costa, in Contra Costa County, on August 15, 1978, approximately 2 weeks after she was last seen alive. Like Roggasch, Colon had been strangled and her body dumped in a rural area. The similarity in the victim's initials, RR and CC, wasn't immediately recognized as significant. After all, coincidences happen, especially in unrelated murder cases separated by time and geography. But as more bodies would eventually be discovered, this pattern would become impossible to ignore. Pamela Parsons, a 38-year-old woman whose body was found on September 19, 1993, in Yuba County, shared the same double-initial pattern, PP. Then came Tracy Tafoya, 31 years old, discovered in Yuba County on August 14, 1994, TT. The pattern was unmistakable, but still, investigators had no suspect. What makes Naso's case particularly disturbing is how long he operated without detection. From the late 1970s through the mid-1990s, he moved between California and Nevada, working as a photographer and odd-job man, all while harboring his deadly secret. He wasn't a transient or drifter in the traditional sense. He maintained residences, paid taxes, and to outward appearances, lived a relatively normal life. This ability to blend in, to appear unremarkable, gave him the perfect cover for his crimes. The break in the case came from an unexpected source and wouldn't arrive until 2010, more than 3 decades after his first known murder. By this time, Naso was 76 years old, living in Reno, Nevada. In April of that year, he was arrested for a probation violation after a routine home inspection by his probation officer. Naso had been on probation for a theft conviction, a seemingly minor offense compared to the horrors that authorities were about to uncover. During the search of Naso's home, probation officers discovered something disturbing: a list. Written in Naso's own handwriting, it contained references to 10 women, described in cryptic terms. "Girl near Lagunitas," read one entry. Another mentioned "girl from Linda," and still another, "girl from MRV." These locations corresponded to places where bodies had been found years earlier. It was a trophy list, a catalogue of his victims. But the list wasn't the only damning evidence found in Naso's home. Investigators also discovered a vast collection of photographs, thousands of them, many depicting women in various states of undress, unconscious, or positioned to appear dead. Some of the women in these photos have never been identified, raising the grim possibility that Naso's victim count may be higher than the 6 murders he was eventually charged with. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Naso's meticulously kept rape journal, hundreds of pages detailing sexual assaults dating back to the 1950s. The journal contained explicit descriptions of attacks on women, including dates, locations, and the names of victims. It was as if Naso wanted to preserve every moment of his crimes, to relive them through his writings and photographs. The discovery of these materials led to a full-scale investigation into Naso's past. Detectives began the painstaking process of connecting the cryptic entries in his list to known murders and missing persons cases. They re-examined cold cases, particularly those involving women with matching initials for their first and last names. DNA evidence was reanalyzed using modern techniques not available when the crimes were first committed. The connections began to solidify. DNA from Naso's ex-wife was found on the pantyhose used to strangle Roxene Roggasch. Naso's DNA was discovered on Roggasch's fingernails, suggesting she had fought for her life. Hairs belonging to Naso were found on the clothing of Carmen Collin. Photographs of both Pamela Parsons and Tracy Tafoya were discovered among Naso's collection. As investigators dug deeper, they found more evidence linking Naso to the murders. His diaries contained entries that corresponded with the dates when victims disappeared. Receipts and travel records placed him in the vicinity of where bodies were discovered. Slowly but surely, the case against Joseph Naso was building. In April 2011, Naso was formally charged with the murders of Roggasch, Collin, Parsons, and Tafoya. He was held in the Marin County Jail on $10 million bail while prosecutors prepared their case. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty. Naso, in a decision that would prove disastrous for him, chose to represent himself at trial. Despite having no legal training, he insisted on acting as his own attorney, a right granted to him under California law. The judge appointed a legal advisor to assist him, but Naso made all the key decisions about his defense strategy. The trial began in June 2013 in Marin County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: the list, the photographs, the DNA matches, the diary entries. They brought forward witnesses who testified about Naso's strange behavior and his obsession with photographing women in death-like poses. Naso's defense was bizarre and ineffective. He rambled during his opening statement, attacked the credibility of witnesses, and tried to portray himself as a legitimate photographer whose work had been misinterpreted. He claimed the women in his photographs were willing models, that his writings were merely fantasy, and that the DNA evidence had been contaminated or mishandled. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from Naso's own writings. In a diary entry dated 1961, he wrote about picking up a woman in Berkeley and described what prosecutors argued was a sexual assault. "I had to knock her out first," the entry read. "Then I tied her up and had intercourse with her." This entry, along with dozens of others, painted a picture of a man with a long history of violence against women. Throughout the trial, Naso remained defiant. He cross-examined witnesses himself, often asking inappropriate or irrelevant questions. He showed no remorse, no emotion when photographs of his victims were displayed in court. His demeanor, cold, calculating, and sometimes angry, did him no favors with the jury. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented evidence that Naso had a pattern of approaching women, offering to photograph them, and then attacking them. They showed that he kept detailed records of his crimes and trophies from his victims. They established that he had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit each of the murders. After a trial lasting nearly 2 months, the case went to the jury in August 2013. It took them just 8 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. Joseph Naso, at the age of 79, was convicted of the murders of Roxene Roggasch, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, and Tracy Tafoya. The penalty phase of the trial followed, during which prosecutors presented evidence suggesting Naso was responsible for at least 2 additional murders: Sharalia Patton, whose body was found in Marin County in 1981, and an unidentified woman whose remains were discovered in Nevada County in the mid-1990s. Though Naso was not charged with these crimes, the evidence was presented to support the argument for the death penalty. In November 2013, the same jury that convicted Naso recommended that he be sentenced to death. The judge agreed, and on January 24, 2014, Joseph Naso was formally sentenced to death for his crimes. Given his advanced age, it was unlikely he would ever be executed. California hadn't carried out an execution since 2006 due to legal challenges to its lethal injection protocol. But the sentence reflected the gravity of his crimes. What makes the Joseph Naso case particularly haunting is not just the brutality of his crimes, but the methodical way he documented them. His photographs, journals, and list reveal a man who took pleasure not just in killing, but in preserving the memory of his actions. He wanted to revisit his crimes again and again through his writings and images. The case also raises disturbing questions about how Naso managed to evade capture for so long. From the 1970s through the 1990s, he killed with impunity, moving between California and Nevada, leaving a trail of victims that went unconnected for decades. It wasn't until modern DNA technology and a routine probation check that his crimes were finally uncovered. For the families of Roxene Roggasch, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, and Tracy Tafoya, the conviction brought a measure of closure after decades of uncertainty. But it also underscored the random, senseless nature of their loved ones' deaths. They were targeted not because of who they were, but because their names fit a pattern that satisfied Naso's twisted obsession. The double initial case also has an unusual connection to another series of murders that occurred on the opposite side of the country. In the early 1970s, 3 young girls, all with double initials, were murdered in the Rochester, New York area. These victims were Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza. The similarity in names, particularly Carmen Colon, which matches one of Naso's California victims, led to speculation that Naso might have been responsible for these crimes as well, especially since he was born in Rochester and lived there during the time of the murders. However, investigations have not conclusively linked Naso to the Rochester murders. Another man, Kenneth Bianchi, who later became infamous as one of the Hillside Stranglers in Los Angeles, was also investigated for the Rochester crimes, but was never charged. The Rochester double initial murders remain officially unsolved. The bizarre coincidence of 2 separate sets of double initial murders occurring on opposite coasts remains one of the strangest aspects of the Naso case. It suggests either an extraordinary coincidence or the possibility that Naso's killing spree was even more extensive than proven in court. Joseph Naso's crimes reveal the dark capabilities that can hide behind an ordinary facade. To his neighbors in Reno, he was just an elderly man, perhaps a bit eccentric, but not obviously dangerous. To the women he photographed for legitimate modeling work, he was a professional, if somewhat odd, photographer. No one suspected that behind this mundane exterior lurked a predator responsible for at least 6 murders spanning more than 2 decades. The discovery of Naso's crimes also highlights the advances in forensic science that have revolutionized cold case investigations. DNA evidence that sat untested for years was finally analyzed using modern techniques, providing the crucial links between Naso and his victims. Without these advances, he might have taken his secrets to the grave. Joseph Naso remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. Given his age, he would now be in his late 80s if still alive, and the lengthy appeals process for death penalty cases in California, it's unlikely he will ever be executed. Instead, he will likely spend his remaining days in prison, surrounded by the concrete and steel that now define the boundaries of his world. The story of Joseph Naso and his double initial murders serves as a chilling reminder of the predators who may walk among us undetected. It underscores the importance of advances in forensic science, the value of cold case investigations, and the persistence of law enforcement in pursuing justice even decades after crimes are committed. For the communities where Naso's victims were found, Marin County, Contra Costa County, Yuba County, his capture and conviction brought an end to a long-standing mystery. Women who had been reduced to crime statistics, their cases growing colder with each passing year, finally received justice. Their names, Roxene Roggasch, Carmen Collin, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya, are no longer just entries in unsolved case files, but reminders of lives cut short by a killer who thought he had gotten away with murder. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Naso case is the question it raises about other potential victims. The list found in his home contained references to 10 women, but he was only convicted of killing 4. The thousands of photographs in his collection show countless women, many unidentified, some appearing unconscious or dead. How many more victims might there be? How many families are still waiting for answers about loved ones who disappeared decades ago? The investigation into Joseph Naso's potential additional victims continues to this day. Authorities have worked diligently to identify the women in the thousands of photographs recovered from his home. Many of these images show women in vulnerable positions, posed in ways that suggest they may have been unconscious or even deceased at the time the photographs were taken. The sheer volume of this material has made the task of identification enormously challenging for investigators. One of the most troubling aspects of Naso's case is the methodical nature of his documentation. Beyond the photographs and journals, investigators discovered a ledger in which Naso had recorded expenses related to his crimes. Entries included costs for travel to locations where bodies were later discovered, purchases of items later used in the murders, and even expenses for cleaning supplies. This level of organization and record-keeping reveals a calculating mind that approached murder with the same precision one might bring to a business venture. During his incarceration, Naso has remained largely unrepentant. In prison interviews, he has continued to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He has attempted to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, a misunderstood artist whose work has been misinterpreted by authorities. This narrative rings hollow against the mountain of physical evidence and his own writings that detail his crimes. The investigation into Naso's background revealed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the murders for which he was convicted. Former acquaintances described him as controlling and manipulative, particularly in his relationships with women. He had a history of domestic violence allegations, though many incidents went unreported or unprosecuted. This pattern of escalating behavior is common among serial killers, who often begin with lesser offenses before graduating to murder. One particularly disturbing aspect of Naso's case was his method of approaching victims. As a photographer, he had a built-in pretext for approaching women, offering them modeling opportunities or professional portraits. This gave him access to potential victims and allowed him to establish a level of trust before attacking. It's a reminder of how predators often exploit legitimate professional roles to gain access to victims. The locations where Naso disposed of his victims' bodies also reveal a calculated mind at work. Each body was found in a remote area, away from population centers, reducing the chance of immediate discovery. Yet they weren't so remote as to prevent eventual discovery. It's as if Naso wanted his victims to be found, but only after he had sufficient time to distance himself from the crimes. This pattern suggests a killer who took pride in his work and wanted it acknowledged, even if he himself remained anonymous. The double initial pattern that became Naso's signature presents one of the most unusual aspects of his case. Criminal profilers have suggested that this pattern may have represented a form of control or power for Naso, a way of selecting victims that satisfied some internal logic or compulsion. By choosing women whose first and last names began with the same letter, he was imposing his own criteria on the selection process, transforming random opportunity into something that felt predetermined to him. Forensic psychologists who have studied the case suggest that Naso likely derived satisfaction not just from the murders themselves, but from the entire process, the selection of victims based on his criteria, the planning, the act itself, and the subsequent documentation through photographs and writings. Each element fed into his need for control and his desire to relive the experiences. The discovery of Naso's crimes also led investigators to re-examine other unsolved murders with similar characteristics. In addition to the Rochester double initial murders, authorities looked at cold cases across California and Nevada, particularly those involving women found strangled in remote locations. While no definitive connections have been established beyond the 6 murders attributed to him, the possibility remains that Naso's true victim count is higher. One case that received renewed attention was that of Sarah Dillon, a homeless woman who disappeared from Nevada County in 1997. Dillon's name doesn't follow the double initial pattern, but her disappearance occurred in an area where Naso is known to have lived, and during a period when he was active. Her body was never found, but items belonging to her were allegedly discovered among Naso's possessions. Though he was never charged with her murder, investigators consider him a strong suspect. Another potential victim was a woman identified in Naso's list only as Girl from Woodland. Investigators believe this may refer to Lou Ellen Burley, who disappeared from Walnut Creek in 1977. Burley had gone to meet a photographer about a modeling job the day she vanished, a detail that aligns with Naso's known method of approaching victims. Her remains were eventually found in 2011 in a remote area of Nevada County. While DNA evidence was insufficient to conclusively link Naso to her murder, the circumstances make him a prime suspect. The investigation into Naso's crimes also revealed the evolution of his methods over time. His earlier murders appear to have been somewhat less organized, with more evidence left behind. As he continued killing, he became more careful, more methodical. This pattern of refinement is common among serial killers who evade capture for extended periods. They learn from each crime, adjusting their methods to reduce the risk of detection. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that Naso didn't work alone in all of his crimes. Some of the photographs in his collection appeared to have been taken from angles that would have been difficult for a single photographer to achieve while also posing or restraining a victim. This has led to speculation that Naso might have had an accomplice in at least some of his crimes, though no other individual has ever been charged in connection with the murders. The possibility of an accomplice adds another layer of complexity to the case. If Naso did have help, who was it? And are they still out there? These questions continue to trouble investigators who worked on the case. Some have suggested that Naso's ex-wife, whose DNA was found on the pantyhose used to strangle Roxene Roggasch, might have had knowledge of his crimes. However, she has maintained that she was unaware of his activities, and no evidence has emerged to contradict this claim. One of the most poignant aspects of the Naso case is the impact on the families of his victims. For decades, they lived with uncertainty, not knowing who had taken their loved ones or why. The identification of Naso as the killer brought answers but also reopened old wounds. During the penalty phase of his trial, family members gave impact statements describing the devastating effects of their losses. Carmen Colin's daughter spoke of growing up without her mother, of milestones missed and questions unanswered. Tracy Tafoya's sister described the years of searching, of jumping at every phone call in hopes it might bring news. Pamela Parsons' brother talked about the hole left in their family, a void that could never be filled. These testimonies served as powerful reminders that behind the clinical details of the investigation were real people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by Naso's actions. The case also had a profound impact on the investigators who worked it. Many described the Naso investigation as the most disturbing of their careers. The combination of the photographs, the detailed journals, and the list created a window into the mind of a killer that was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Several detectives reported having nightmares about the images they had seen, haunted by the faces of women who might have been Naso's unidentified victims. For the communities where the bodies were found, Naso's capture and conviction brought a sense of closure, but also raised uncomfortable questions. How had this killer moved among them undetected for so long? How many other predators might be hiding in plain sight? The case prompted increased vigilance and renewed attention to unsolved murders and missing persons cases throughout California. The investigation into Naso also highlighted the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies. His crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions, Marin County, Contra Costa County, Yuba County, requiring coordination between different sheriff's departments, police forces, and district attorneys' offices. The successful prosecution resulted from these agencies sharing information and resources, a model for how complex, multi-jurisdictional cases can be handled effectively. The role of probation officers in breaking the case cannot be overstated. It was a routine home inspection by Naso's probation officer in Reno that led to the discovery of the list and photographs. This underscores the critical function these officers serve in public safety, often with limited resources and heavy caseloads. Had that inspection been delayed or conducted less thoroughly, Naso might have continued to evade justice. As with many serial killer cases, the Naso investigation has prompted changes in how law enforcement approaches cold cases and evidence preservation. The decades-long gap between the murders and Naso's arrest demonstrates the value of maintaining evidence, even when cases appear to have gone cold. The DNA samples that eventually helped convict him had been preserved for over 30 years, waiting for technology to advance sufficiently to analyze them effectively. The case has also become a subject of study for criminologists and forensic psychologists. Naso's extensive documentation of his crimes provides rare insight into the mind of a serial killer, his motivations, his selection process, his evolution over time. This information has been used to refine profiling techniques and to train new generations of investigators in recognizing the patterns associated with serial predators. For true crime enthusiasts and researchers, the Naso case stands out for its unusual characteristics. The double initial pattern, the photography connection, the detailed record keeping, all combine to make it one of the most distinctive serial killer cases in American criminal history. Books, documentaries, and podcasts have explored various aspects of the case, bringing renewed attention to the victims and the investigation that finally brought their killer to justice. In the years since Naso's conviction, authorities have continued to investigate cold cases that might be connected to him. In 2019, investigators announced they were using advanced DNA techniques to re-examine evidence from unsolved murders in areas where Naso had lived or traveled. This ongoing work reflects the commitment to ensuring that all of his victims receive justice, no matter how many years have passed. The possibility that Naso might be connected to the Rochester double initial murders remains particularly intriguing. The coincidence of two sets of murders, both targeting victims with matching initials, occurring in places where Naso had lived, seems too remarkable to be random chance. Yet definitive proof has remained elusive. The Rochester Police Department has maintained that their investigation into these crimes continues, though the passage of time makes resolution increasingly unlikely. One theory that has been proposed is that Naso might have been inspired by the Rochester murders when beginning his own killing spree in California. Having lived in Rochester during the time those crimes occurred, he would have been aware of them. The idea that he might have adopted the double initial pattern as a form of homage or copycat behavior is disturbing but not implausible. Serial killers have been known to draw inspiration from other murders, incorporating elements that appeal to their particular psychopathology. What makes this theory particularly compelling is the victim named Carmen Colon in both series of murders. The statistical probability of this being mere coincidence is vanishingly small. However, without physical evidence linking Naso to the Rochester crimes, this remains speculative. The Rochester Carmen Colon was only 10 years old when she was murdered, significantly younger than Naso's known California victims, who were all adult women. This difference in victim profile has led some investigators to remain skeptical about his involvement in the Rochester cases. As Joseph Naso ages on death row, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. The list found in his home suggests at least 10 victims, but he was only convicted of killing 4. The thousands of photographs in his collection, many showing unidentified women in vulnerable positions, hint at a much larger victim pool. Some of these women have been identified as living models who worked with Naso legitimately, but others remain unknown. Are they additional victims, or simply subjects of Naso's disturbing photography who escaped becoming victims? For law enforcement, the task of identifying these women continues. Periodically, authorities release selected images to the public, hoping someone might recognize a face, a location, a piece of clothing. Each identification brings the possibility of closure for another family and the potential to link Naso to additional crimes. It's painstaking work, made more difficult by the passage of time and the poor quality of some of the images, but it reflects the commitment to ensuring that all of Naso's victims are accounted for. The Joseph Naso case serves as a reminder of the patient, persistent work required to solve cold cases. The murders of Roxene Roggasch, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, and Tracy Tafoya might never have been solved without the dedication of investigators who refused to let these cases fade into obscurity. Their work exemplifies the best of law enforcement, the commitment to justice that transcends the passage of time, the determination to speak for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. It's also a testament to the advances in forensic science that have revolutionized cold case investigations. The DNA evidence that helped convict Naso had been collected decades earlier, at a time when the technology to analyze it effectively didn't exist. By preserving this evidence, investigators ensured that when the technology caught up, justice could still be served. This foresight has become standard practice in homicide investigations, with evidence preservation protocols designed to anticipate future technological advances. For the communities affected by Naso's crimes, his capture and conviction brought a measure of peace. The knowledge that a predator had been removed from their midst, that the mysterious deaths that had troubled them for decades had finally been explained, allowed for a kind of collective healing. Memorial services were held for the victims, providing an opportunity for public acknowledgement of the lives lost and the suffering of their families. The story of Joseph Naso is, at its core, a story about justice delayed, but not denied. It's about the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up on cold cases, the advances in forensic science that made solving those cases possible, and the resilience of communities and families who never lost hope that answers would eventually come. It's a reminder that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of emerging from the shadows. As we reflect on the case of the double initial murders, we're reminded of the human cost of such crimes. Roxene Roggasch, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya, and the other women who may have fallen victim to Joseph Naso were not just names in a case file or entries on a killer's list. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their lives were cut short by a predator who saw them not as human beings, but as objects to satisfy his twisted desires. In remembering them, we honor their memory and acknowledge the void their absence created in the lives of those who knew them. We recognize the pain of families who spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. And we appreciate the dedication of the law enforcement professionals who worked tirelessly to provide answers and ensure that Joseph Naso would never have the opportunity to claim another victim. The case of Joseph Naso and the double initial murders stands as one of the most distinctive and disturbing chapters in the annals of American crime. It reminds us of the darkness that can hide behind an ordinary facade, the importance of persistence in the pursuit of justice, and the power of forensic science to solve cases long gone cold. But most importantly, it reminds us of the victims, women whose lives and deaths must not be forgotten, whose stories deserve to be told, and whose memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them.